The wedding and the secret pendant. The morning light streamed through the tall stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Cathedral, painting the marble floor in waves of gold, ruby, and emerald. Rebecca Winters stood before a tall antique mirror, her reflection framed by the delicate lace and silk of her wedding gown. The dress itself had been handcrafted by a Parisian designer whose creations were spoken of as though they belonged in museums. Yet today, the masterpiece of silk and lace seemed to pale in comparison to the bride herself. Her auburn hair, coiled loosely at the back of her head, caught flecks of sunlight, and her green eyes shimmered with both excitement and a quiet tension she had been unable to shake. To anyone looking in, she appeared the picture of a radiant bride moments away from her dream ceremony. Yet beneath the lace collar of her dress lay a secret she had never told her soon-to-be husband, not even in their most honest late-night conversations. Against her chest, warm and alive, pulsed a small silver pendant, a relic she had carried since birth, given to her by a mother she had no memory of. Rebecca touched the pendant gently as her maid of honor, Jennifer, fussed with the flowing train of her gown. Jennifer's voice was warm and teasing, telling her she looked radiant, like she belonged in the pages of a fairy tale book. Rebecca smiled at the words, but her hand pressed a little harder against the pendant. It was hotter than it had ever been, almost as though it had awakened with the bells of the cathedral. She whispered to herself that it was only nerves, but she knew that was not true. The pendant had always had moods, if one could call it that. Sometimes it was cool and silent, almost forgettable, and sometimes, like today, it pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart, as if alive in its own strange way. Across the cathedral, James Harrison stood in the groom's chamber, adjusting his bow tie in front of a polished oak mirror. Tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly handsome in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, James looked every bit the successful architect he was. He had built towers of glass and steel that changed skylines, yet even as he straightened his cuffs, he admitted to himself that none of his creations could compare to the woman he was about to marry. His best friend and business partner, David, clapped him on the shoulder and joked about nerves, and James admitted with a grin that yes, he was terrified, but only because he had never known happiness could be so large and so fragile all at once. He told David that Rebecca was everything he never knew he was missing. Intelligent, graceful, compassionate. There was something in her presence that felt almost otherworldly. When she smiled at him, it was as though she could see through his defenses, past the polished image he carried in the business world, directly into his soul. Guests began filing into the cathedral, their footsteps echoing across the marble, their murmurs blending into a soft ocean of anticipation. Rebecca's heart pounded faster with every chime of the cathedral bells. She smoothed the fabric of her gown, steadied her breath, and finally stepped into the grand hallway that would carry her to the altar. The massive oak doors creaked open, revealing hundreds of candles casting their glow across rows of roses and gathered family. A hush fell over the crowd as the music began, and Rebecca lifted her eyes. There he was, James. Standing tall, his dark hair brushed neatly back, his blue eyes fixed entirely on her. The world melted away, but for a strange, growing hum that seemed to rise not from the organ, nor the murmurs, but from within her very chest. With each step, the pendant beneath her dress grew warmer, and she noticed that the flames of the candles flickered in rhythm with her stride, swaying not with the natural draft of the cathedral, but in unison, as though in reverence to her approach. She tried to keep her focus on James, tried to push down the unease, but halfway down the aisle another phenomenon seized her attention. The stained glass windows, intricate depictions of saints, angels, and long-forgotten scenes, flared with color, more vivid than any artist's hand could produce. Glowing brighter than the sun outside should have allowed. The guests whispered in delight, assuming it to be some clever trick of light, while James, ever the architect, stiffened, recognizing it as something unnatural. When she reached the altar, James took her hands, and both of them gasped softly at the sensation. It was as if a current of gentle electricity passed between their palms. Her hands were warm, far warmer than nerves should allow, and her skin seemed to glow faintly, a luminescence only James could see from that close. "You're glowing," he whispered with a smile meant to calm her. "Literally glowing." Rebecca forced a laugh, her lips trembling as though she knew there was truth to his words. The priest began his solemn words, speaking of love, devotion, and the sacred bond of marriage. Yet even he stumbled for a brief moment when his eyes caught the shimmer of light moving across the cathedral walls, the shifting brilliance of glass and stone dancing with a radiance that no candle could provide. Rebecca recited her vows with a voice steady but charged, as though every word carried a depth she herself did not fully understand. She promised to stand by James, to share with him all that she was, even the parts of herself she had yet to discover. James spoke in return, declaring that from the moment they met he knew she would change his life forever, vowing to embrace whatever mysteries lay ahead. When Father Michael pronounced them husband and wife, James leaned forward and kissed her. The instant their lips touched, the cathedral exploded in light. Not blinding, not harsh, but overwhelming in its beauty. The stained glass ignited with swirling colors that seemed to breathe and move, and for the briefest moment, every guest felt something inexplicable wash over them, a wave of peace, a quiet joy that reached deeper than words. They gasped, some wept, others pressed their hands over their hearts. When the kiss ended, Rebecca and James stared at each other in wonder, their breath unsteady, their hearts pounding. They both knew what had just happened was no illusion. The light slowly receded, the guests erupted in applause, and the couple walked back down the aisle, now husband and wife. Yet James leaned close, his voice low and urgent, asking, "That wasn't normal, was it? Tell me I'm not crazy." Rebecca clutched his arm tightly, her eyes soft yet shadowed with secrets. "I don't know," she whispered, though James could sense she knew more than she admitted. "Whatever it is, whatever happens, please believe this. My love for you is real." The reception carried on with laughter, music, and dancing, but James's gaze rarely left his new wife. She was radiant, yes, but there were moments when she anticipated someone's arrival before the door opened, when she laughed, and the flowers around her seemed to bloom brighter. That filled him with both awe and unease. Guests noticed, too, commenting on her glow, her aura, but only James kept track of the strange coincidences stacking higher and higher. When the night came to an end and they slipped away to begin their honeymoon, James found himself restless. As their car carried them toward the airport, he glanced at Rebecca, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand still pressing faintly against her chest as though shielding the pendant. He thought back to the kiss, to the cathedral awash in light, and a single thought rooted itself in his mind. He had married the woman of his dreams, but he did not yet fully know who she was. Hours later, in the quiet of their honeymoon suite, in the Caribbean, James woke to the sound of the balcony doors sliding open. The ocean wind filled the room with the scent of salt and hibiscus. He rose, finding Rebecca standing barefoot on the balcony, the moonlight painting her gown silver. Her hands were clasped over her chest. The pendant shone through the lace, glowing steadily, pulsing with light like a living heart. She whispered words he could not understand into the night air, a language foreign and melodic. The sound chilled him, not with fear, but with the dawning realization that his new wife carried a truth far greater than either of them had spoken. James stepped toward her, calling her name softly. Rebecca turned, her eyes shimmering with both love and terror, and for the first time since the day began, James realized that their honeymoon was not simply the start of a marriage. It was the threshold to a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved. The Island of Whispers. The Caribbean greeted them with a warmth that wrapped around the skin like a lover's embrace. The plane descended through clouds tinged with coral and violet, the sea below glittering in shades of turquoise that seemed to shimmer with secrets. James sat by the window, his hand resting over Rebecca's. She was smiling softly, gazing out at the water with an expression caught somewhere between peace and melancholy. From a distance, she looked like any other newlywed bride eager for her honeymoon adventure, yet James couldn't forget the night before, The glow of her pendant, the strange words she whispered into the moonlit air. He hadn't pressed her about it on the flight, not wanting to darken the anticipation of their trip, but his thoughts kept circling back like restless gulls above a fishing boat. He told himself that when the moment was right, he would ask her, again. For now, he would simply hold her hand and let the island speak for itself. They arrived at the resort in the late afternoon, greeted by staff in linen uniforms carrying cool drinks and flower leis. The place looked like paradise carved into reality. White sand stretched endlessly, kissed by rolling waves, and gardens heavy with hibiscus and orchids sprawled around the villas. The resort was famous for being secluded, a place where the wealthy came to disappear for a while, and it seemed as though the island had been designed specifically for romance. Their suite overlooked the ocean, its balcony framed with bamboo, and sheer curtains swaying gently in the salt-kissed wind. Rebecca laughed softly when she stepped inside, running her fingers over the carved mahogany furniture and inhaling the fragrance of fresh jasmine placed by the bedside. James, watching her, felt his heart ache with how effortlessly she filled every space with her presence. And yet, in the back of his mind, the image of that pendant glowing in the night would not leave him. Dinner was served on the beach that night, candles flickering inside glass lanterns while waves lapped at the shore. Other couples were scattered across the sand, their laughter carrying into the wind. But for James and Rebecca, it felt as if the world had reduced itself to just the two of them. The sea reflected stars like a second sky, and James reached across the table, brushing a strand of auburn hair from Rebecca's cheek. "You're more beautiful than this entire island," he whispered. And though her eyes sparkled, he noticed the pendant shift faintly against her collarbone, glowing with a pulse too subtle for anyone else to see. Rebecca laughed softly to deflect his stare and raised her glass. "To us," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "To the beginning of forever." For a while he let himself be carried by the rhythm of the night, the music of waves, the warmth of her hand, the soft glow of lanterns. Yet fate had its way of intruding. A sudden cry rang out from further down the beach, sharp and panicked. Guest turned toward the sound as a little boy stumbled, clutching his leg where a shard of seashell had cut deep into his skin. Blood streaked the sand, and his mother rushed toward him, panic in her eyes. Without hesitation, Rebecca was on her feet. Her gown trailed behind her as she knelt beside the child, her hands gentle as she whispered soft words. James hurried after her, but by the time he reached them, something extraordinary had already begun. Rebecca pressed her palm over the wound, her eyes closing briefly, and within seconds the bleeding slowed, the child's cries quieted, and when she lifted her hand, the wound looked as though it had been healing for days instead of seconds. The boy blinked in wonder, then threw his arms around Rebecca, burying his face against her chest. His mother wept, thanking her over and over again, while the other guests gasped at what they had seen. Some murmured words like miracle and gift, while others looked on with suspicion, their eyes narrowing at the sight of something that defied explanation. James froze. He had seen her comfort children before, but this was different. He glanced at Rebecca's pendant, which glowed faintly even as she soothed the child. She caught James's eyes, a silent plea passing between them. "Please, don't ask me. Not here, not now." He swallowed the 100 questions clawing at his throat, forcing himself to smile as if this were nothing more than compassion. Yet deep down he knew the island had witnessed something far greater. That night, as they walked back to their villa, whispers followed them. Guests stared, some with admiration, others with unease, as if Rebecca were something both holy and frightening. James slipped an arm protectively around her, shielding her from their stares, but when they reached the quiet of their suite, he closed the door and turned to her. "Rebecca," he said softly, his voice trembling with the weight of what he had seen. "You have to tell me the truth. What happened back there?" She hesitated, her hand flying to the pendant at her chest, as though it might shield her from the question. "I don't know how to explain it," she admitted finally. Sometimes things happen around me. things I can't control. I feel connected somehow, as if I can sense pain before it happens, or calm storms before they break. Ever since I was a little girl, it's been this way. And the pendant, it's always been part of it. I don't understand it either, James. I've kept it hidden because I was afraid of what people would think. Her voice cracked, tears pooling in her eyes. James stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest. He wanted to tell her not to worry, that none of it mattered, but he could not ignore what he had seen. He kissed, her hair whispering, "We'll figure this out together. I don't care what it is, Rebecca, you're my wife, and that's all that matters." She clung to him tightly, her body trembling with both relief and fear. In the days that followed, the island seemed to hold its breath around them. Rebecca's presence did not go unnoticed. Staff bowed their heads when she passed, whispering among themselves in the native tongue. An elderly gardener, his face weathered by years under the sun, stopped James one morning to speak in hushed tones. "She carries the light," he said, pointing toward Rebecca as she walked among the flowers. "The child of balance. We have waited long for her." James froze, his heart thundering. He asked the man what he meant, but the gardener only shook his head and walked away, muttering prayers under his breath. That evening, James found himself unable to sleep. He awoke to the sound of Rebecca again on the balcony, the pendant glowing brighter than ever. This time he lingered in the shadows, listening. Her voice rose softly, melodic and strange, a language that felt ancient, as though it carried the weight of centuries. She spoke to the night, her words directed not at him but at something beyond. The pendant pulsed with each syllable, sending ripples of light across her skin. James's breath caught in his throat. He had married the woman he loved more than life itself, but as he watched her bathed in moonlight, speaking words he could not comprehend, one thought burned in his mind. Who is she really? Rebecca turned suddenly, her eyes wide, catching him watching. For a moment the air between them felt heavy with truth unspoken. She reached for him, her voice trembling. "James, there's something I need to tell you. Something about who I am and where I come from." And in that moment, as the waves crashed against the shore and the pendant glowed like a living flame, James knew their honeymoon had transformed into something far beyond romance. It had become the beginning of a revelation, one that might either bind them closer than ever or shatter everything they thought they knew about love and destiny. The truth revealed, the waves whispered against the rocks as Rebecca stood on the balcony, her silhouette framed in silver by the rising moon. The pendant on her chest glowed steadily, a heartbeat of light that pulsed with the rhythm of her trembling breaths. James had never felt so torn in his life. He wanted to reach for her, to gather her in his arms and promise that nothing, absolutely nothing, could shake the love he carried for her. Yet his mind was filled with images of the cathedral ablaze with unnatural color, of the child's wound closing beneath her touch, of her soft voice reciting words in a language that seemed to belong to the ancient marrow of the earth itself. He knew she loved him. He had never doubted that. But as he looked at her now, standing in the glow of something he did not understand, he felt the full weight of a truth he had ignored since the moment they met. Rebecca had always been touched by a strangeness she herself barely understood. She turned to him, her eyes luminous in the dim light, filled with both fear and determination. "James," she said softly, her voice carrying over the sound of the ocean. "I should have told you long ago. I wanted to, but I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you would look at me differently. Afraid you would see me as something less human, less real." She placed her hand over the pendant, and for a moment the glow dimmed as though listening to her. "But you deserve to know the truth, especially now." James stepped closer, his chest tight, his throat dry. "Whatever it is, Rebecca, tell me. I'd rather face the truth than be left in the dark." She exhaled shakily, then walked back into the villa, motioning for him to follow. They sat together on the edge of the bed, the sound of waves crashing faintly through the open balcony doors. Rebecca reached into the neckline of her gown and pulled the pendant free. It gleamed in the candlelight, an oval of silver and crystal, etched with markings too intricate to be random. She turned it in her fingers, her expression far away. This has been with me for as long as I can remember. My mother left it with me before she died. I was only a baby. No one knew where she came from, not even the foster families who raised me. All I was told was that she appeared at a hospital one night, carrying me in her arms, already weak from an illness no one could identify. She pressed this pendant into the doctor's hand before she passed and told him it would protect me. Her voice caught, but she pushed on. I grew up moving from home to home, never belonging anywhere. But this was always with me. And strange things began happening as I got older. Lights flickering when I was upset. Plants blooming out of season in places I had touched. Children and animals calming when I held them. It scared people. Some families sent me back to the system saying I was cursed. Others kept me, but never looked at me the same way again. So I learned to hide it, to pretend nothing was different. Until you. James stared at her, his heart aching at the thought of her as a child, shunned and misunderstood. He reached out and clasped her hand. Rebecca, none of that changes how I see you. You're my wife. You're the woman I fell in love with. Whatever this pendant is, whatever these gifts are, they don't make you less human. They make you remarkable. Tears welled in her eyes and she smiled faintly. That's why I married you, because you never looked at me like I was strange. You saw me, just me. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and for a moment they sat in silence, two souls bound together by love, surrounded by mysteries neither could yet solve. But the silence was not to last. The next morning, Rebecca suggested they meet with a local historian who lived in the old village on the far side of the island. She had overheard staff whispering that he knew the legends of the pendant, the so-called Child of the Light. James hesitated. Part of him wanted to shield her from whatever truths might come, but another part knew that ignorance could no longer protect them. If there were answers to be found, they had to seek them out together. The village lay tucked between cliffs and mangroves, far from the polished beauty of the resort. Children played barefoot in the dirt streets. Women hung laundry from lines stretched between stone houses, and men repaired fishing nets beneath the shade of palms. They were led to a small cottage draped in vines, where an elderly man with skin weathered like carved wood and eyes sharp as a hawk's greeted them. He introduced himself as Matteo, a keeper of oral histories. When Rebecca showed him the pendant, his eyes widened and he crossed himself before whispering words in his native tongue. "This is no trinket," Matteo said gravely, gesturing for them to enter. Inside, the air smelled of incense and old parchment. He pulled a worn manuscript from a shelf and laid it before them, its pages filled with faded drawings and careful script. He pointed to an illustration that made James's stomach twist. It was of a woman, radiant, holding a glowing pendant at her chest. Around her, people bowed, and beneath the drawing was a symbol identical to the one etched into Rebecca's pendant. Matteo's voice lowered as he spoke. The legend speaks of those born once in a great many generations. Keepers of balance, children who carry the light of harmony within them. They heal, they sense, they calm. But such gifts are not given without purpose. They are meant to restore what has been broken in the world. His gaze shifted to Rebecca. You are one of them. The last, perhaps. And the pendant is the key. It awakens your gift, and one day it will demand of you a choice. Rebecca's hands trembled as she closed the book. I never asked for this, she whispered. I just want to live my life. To be a wife. To love my husband. Matteo nodded solemnly. The gift does not ask if you want it. It only asks what you will do with it. They left the cottage in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. As they walked back through the village, James could feel the eyes of the locals upon them. Some watched with reverence, others with fear. Rebecca's grip on his hand tightened, as though she feared the ground itself might shift beneath her feet. That Evening back at the resort, James sat on the balcony staring at the sea, his thoughts a storm. He had always prided himself on being rational, logical, grounded. Architecture was about structure, certainty, lines, and balance. But now he was confronted with a truth that defied logic, a truth that made his entire world tilt. He turned as Rebecca stepped beside him, her face pale, her eyes searching. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean. Knowing all of this?" James stood and took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Rebecca, I don't care if you can move mountains or light up the sky. I married you because of your heart, because of the way you love, because you make me want to be better. None of this changes that." For the first time in days, she smiled through her tears, pressing her forehead to his. "You're either the bravest man I know," she whispered, "or the most foolish." James kissed her softly, pulling her into his arms as the ocean roared below. But even as he held her, he couldn't ignore the pendant between them, glowing faintly as though it had heard every word and was waiting for the moment when its true purpose would be revealed, and when their love would be tested in ways neither of them yet imagined. Love tested by the unknown. The days that followed their visit to Mateo's cottage should have been filled with nothing but sun-soaked mornings and nights of laughter, yet an invisible weight pressed upon their honeymoon like a veil no breeze could lift. James tried to convince himself that they could return to a semblance of normalcy, but the island seemed unwilling to let them forget. Rebecca's presence alone stirred the air in uncanny ways. When they walked along the beach, the tide would sometimes recede gently around her footprints, as though the ocean itself bent in deference. In the gardens of the resort, flowers turned their faces toward her long before the sun reached them. Even animals seemed drawn to her. Birds fluttered closer, lizards lingered at her feet. Stray cats followed her as if she were some magnetic force. At first, James found these things wondrous. He would watch her with quiet awe, marveling that his wife carried something so extraordinary within her. But as the days wore on, his awe began to fray into unease. Guests whispered more openly now, pointing at Rebecca when they thought she could not hear, calling her the glowing bride, or the woman with the light. Some looked upon her with reverence, but others with suspicion, as though she were dangerous. James caught the way their stares lingered and felt a protective anger ignite within him. It was one thing for him to wrestle with his questions, but it was another for strangers to reduce Rebecca into something less than human, a spectacle to be feared or adored. One night the unease became impossible to ignore. A storm had gathered quickly on the horizon, dark clouds clawing across the sky while the wind whipped the palms into frantic dances. The resort staff urged guests to remain inside, but James and Rebecca stood on the balcony, watching as the storm approached. The ocean heaved with silver-capped waves and thunder growled across the heavens. James turned to suggest they go inside when he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Rebecca was calm. Too calm. She stood with her hands gripping the railing, her eyes closed, her face serene. The pendant against her chest glowed brighter with each roll of thunder. And then, impossibly, the storm shifted. The thunder faded. The clouds began to break and the waves softened into rhythmic swells as though soothed by an unseen hand. James felt his breath catch. He had seen storms change course before, but never in such an abrupt and inexplicable way. He stared at his wife, illuminated by the pendant's glow, and his rational mind rebelled. "Rebecca," he said, his voice hoarse, Did you do that?" She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze filled with both sorrow and fear. "I didn't try to," she whispered. "It just happens. When I feel something deeply, the world seems to respond. Sometimes it frightens me, James. It feels like a part of me is bigger than myself, like I'm only borrowing something I don't truly own." He pulled her into his arms, but even as he held her trembling frame, he could not escape the truth. They were no longer living in a world that obeyed the rules he had always trusted. Their marriage, barely begun, was already bound to forces neither of them could control. The next morning, whispers in the resort grew into tension. A group of guests approached James while Rebecca was in the garden, their voices urgent and low. "She's not normal," one woman said, her eyes darting nervously. "We saw her with the storm. She controls it." Another man, older and braver, added, "This island has old beliefs. People here remember the legends. Some will want to worship her. Others will want her gone." James clenched his fists, anger flaring. "She's my wife," he snapped. "She's not a legend, she's not a curse, she's a human being, and I won't hear another word against her." But when he turned away from them, the words hollowed in his chest, because even he could no longer deny the strangeness that surrounded her. That night he confronted Rebecca gently but firmly. They sat together on the bed, the lantern's glow casting shadows across the walls. "We can't ignore this anymore," James said, his voice heavy. "It's not just about us now. People are watching. Some of them are afraid. I need you to be honest with me. Do you know what's happening to you? Do you know how far this goes?" Rebecca's eyes shimmered with tears, and she shook her head. "I don't know, James. I've lived my whole life feeling like I don't belong, like I'm too much and not enough all at once. And then I met you, and for the first time, I thought I could have a normal life. A home. A future that didn't terrify me. I thought if I kept it hidden, maybe I could escape it, but it's growing stronger and I don't know why. Maybe it's the pendant, maybe it's us." James reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then we face it together. But promise me something. Don't shut me out, don't carry this alone. I don't care what this pendant means or what people say. I only care about us." She nodded, her tears spilling freely now, and pressed her forehead against his. "I promise," she whispered. "I won't hide anymore." For a time it seemed that promise brought them closer, their love deepening in the face of uncertainty. They spent their days walking along hidden coves, their nights curled in each other's arms, whispering dreams and fears into the darkness. Yet the pendant refused to let them rest. One evening, as they sat beneath the stars, it blazed with such intensity that it illuminated the entire balcony. Rebecca gasped, clutching it as visions poured into her mind. She saw a woman, her mother, standing in a field of light, her voice echoing words that Rebecca could barely comprehend. "You are the bridge, you are the balance. But beware, the gift will draw both light and shadow to you." Rebecca collapsed into James's arms, trembling, her breath ragged. He held her tightly, his own heart pounding with terror at what she had seen. "What does it mean?" he asked desperately, but she could only shake her head, tears streaming down her face. The resort staff found them later, pale and shaken, and murmured prayers as they guided them back inside. James noticed the way some of the staff averted their eyes as though looking at Rebecca directly might burn them. Others touched her hands reverently, whispering blessings under their breath. The division was growing, half in awe, half in fear, and James realized with a sinking dread that they were no longer just newlyweds on a honeymoon. They had become symbols of something far larger than themselves. That night, lying awake beside his sleeping wife, James stared at the ceiling and felt a storm of doubt churning within him. He had promised to love her, to stand beside her, to embrace whatever adventures their future held. But could love withstand this? Could love hold steady against forces that bent nature itself? He looked at Rebecca, her face peaceful in slumber, the pendant still glowing faintly against her skin, and he knew his heart would never let him leave her. Yet for the first time, he feared that the choice might not be his to make. Forever changed. The island was never the same after that night of visions. The sky seemed clearer in the mornings, the flowers brighter in their bloom, and the ocean calmer in its rhythm. But beneath the beauty was a sense of expectancy, as though everything around them waited for Rebecca to make a choice she could not yet see. Guests continued to whisper, some approaching James with reverent awe, others warning him in hushed voices to take his wife and leave before the gift drew attention from forces darker than they could imagine. James listened politely but dismissed them, for he knew in his heart there was no escaping what Rebecca carried. It was part of her, stitched into her very being, and no flight or distance could sever her from it. What mattered now was not running away, but understanding what it truly meant. Rebecca, however, grew quieter in those days. She walked with him along the beach, smiled when he told her stories of his childhood, and leaned into his touch with tenderness. Yet there was a distance in her eyes that James could not ignore. At night she dreamed restlessly, whispering in the same ancient language, her fingers clutching the pendant as though it were her lifeline. More than once James woke to find her standing at the window, staring at the sea with tears streaming down her face. He would wrap his arms around her, whispering that she wasn't alone, but her silence lingered. He feared she was drifting into a place he could not follow. Finally, James made a decision. He returned to Matteo's cottage in the village, determined to demand answers. The old historian received him with the same solemn gaze, as though he had been expecting him all along. James placed the pendant on the table, the crystal glowing even as it left Rebecca's chest. "Tell me the truth," James said firmly. "No more riddles. What is this? And what is it doing to my wife?" Matteo studied the pendant for a long time, then nodded slowly. "It is not a curse, though some will see it that way. Nor is it a blessing in the way you understand. It is a key, James, a key to the part of the human spirit most have forgotten. Your wife's bloodline is rare, sensitive to the unseen threads that bind life together. The pendant awakens this, amplifies it, and connects her to what others cannot feel. It is both gift and burden, for with it she will bring healing, but she will also attract those who wish to use her power for their own ends." James's heart tightened. "Then how do I protect her?" Matteo's eyes softened. "You already are. The gift responds not only to her blood but to her love. Alone it would consume her, overwhelm her until she lost herself in its tide. But with you, with the bond you share, she has an anchor. You balance her. That is why the pendant glowed for you in the cathedral. It recognized the one who could hold her steady when the storm came." James sat back, stunned. He thought of all the moments when the pendant had pulsed brighter in his presence, the way the cathedral had burst with light during their kiss, the way Rebecca herself had always said he grounded her. Could it be that love itself was the missing half of her gift? That his role was not to shield her from it, but to walk with her into whatever future it demanded? When he returned to the resort, he found Rebecca waiting on the balcony, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "James," she whispered, clutching his hands. "I saw something, a vision. My mother spoke to me again. She said the gift is not mine to keep hidden, that soon I will have to choose whether to use it or lose myself to it." Her voice broke and she buried her face against his chest. "I don't want this, James. I just want us. I just want to love you and live a simple life." He held her tightly, stroking her hair, his heart breaking at her pain. "And we will, Rebecca. But maybe loving me, loving us, is part of it. Maybe that's the whole point. You're not meant to do this alone. You're meant to do it with me." That night something extraordinary happened. The pendant flared with a brilliance unlike anything before, bathing the room in light. Instead of fear, Rebecca felt a strange calm as visions swirled around them, her mother's face smiling through the glow, and beyond her images of people healed, storms quieted, communities brought to peace, and always, always James was beside her. Not leading her, not following her, but standing shoulder to shoulder, his hand in hers. The light wrapped around them like a living embrace, and for the first time, Rebecca did not tremble. She felt whole, complete. Not because the gift had lessened, but because she was no longer trying to carry it alone. In the days that followed, a transformation took place. Rebecca no longer tried to suppress what she was. Instead, she allowed it to breathe through her. When a storm threatened the island, she stood at the shoreline, James beside her, and together they calmed the waves with nothing more than their presence and faith. When a sick child in the village was brought to her, she laid her hand on his forehead and the fever broke within hours. Whispers spread of miracles, but this time Rebecca did not shrink from them. she met the eyes of those who came to her not with fear but with quiet humility, reminding them she was no goddess, only a woman blessed with something greater than herself, and with a husband who gave her the strength to carry it. For James, the change was just as profound. He had once believed life was about structure, order, and designs that could be drawn with ruler and ink. But standing beside Rebecca, he learned that the greatest architecture was not made of steel or stone, but of trust, love, and the unseen bonds that hold hearts together. He no longer feared what she was because he understood that what she was could only truly flourish through what they were together. On their final night on the island, they returned to the beach where it had all begun, the place of their first dinner, where the child had been healed and the whispers had started. The ocean stretched before them, vast and eternal, and the stars shone brighter than ever above. James pulled Rebecca close, her head resting against his shoulder, the pendant glowing softly between them. "Do you still wish things had been different?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, her hair brushing his cheek. "No, because if I weren't who I am, I might never have found you. And now I know the truth. This gift was never meant to make me less human. It was meant to remind me what being human truly means. To love, to heal, to belong. And I belong with you." James kissed her softly, the ocean singing around them. "Then whatever comes, we face it together. Always." The waves lapped at their feet. The stars bore silent witness, and the pendant glowed not with fire or storm, but with a steady, gentle warmth, the light of love itself, eternal and unbreakable. Their honeymoon had begun with secrets and shadows, but it ended with truth and clarity. They were no longer just husband and wife. They were partners in a destiny that would carry them far beyond the shores of that island, forever changed, forever bound, forever in love.